Let's just hop straight into the benchmarks. I'll give you final thoughts at the end. Here we're looking at Cyberpunk 2077, 1080p ray tracing ultra, and we're seeing the 4060 Ti beating its predecessor, the 3060 Ti, by about 16%. But that only puts its frame rate into the mid 40 FPS range. Now, you can enable frame generation, pushing you well over 60 FPS, but there's a bit of a problem here. If you look down at the very bottom of the screen, I'm using the NVIDIA overlay to monitor the PC latency. The frame generation increases frame rate, but it does that at a cost to latency. And when you get a high enough base frame rate, it's fine. It still feels really good, so there's not a problem in single-player games. However, I found in my personal use case, about 50 milliseconds seems to be my line between feels good enough to actually want to use. And we're over that line here, meaning the base frame rate's not high enough with just enabling frame generation. However, this wasn't enabling any kind of upscaling, and usually you would do both. So here we're now looking at 1080p Ray Tracing Ultra with DLSS at the quality setting on both the 3060 Ti and the 4060 Ti, giving the 4060 Ti now a relative performance of a 20% lead over the 3060 Ti. The 3060 Ti hanging out around that 60 FPS mark, and the 4060 Ti getting up into the 70s. Now, because the overall latency is now lower because of the higher base frame rate, the frame generation doesn't have such a bad hit to the latency, meaning that I actually think frame generation is very usable with this high enough of a base frame rate, and it's now pushing you over 100 frames per second. Now, I don't think that upscaling looks that great at 1080p. That's the one catch here. But if you are willing to use DLSS quality at 1080p, then enabling frame generation I think actually does work really well here. And if I was going to use heavy ray tracing in this game, I do think that the kicking on frame generation to take advantage of a high refresh rate monitor would make a good experience if you have that high enough of a base frame rate. Now, let's take a look at path tracing. So, Cyberpunk did get updated to include the ray tracing overdrive mode. This is their path tracing update. And what you're looking at here is just running it at native 1080p resolution. And it is brutal. So, we're seeing the 4060 Ti winning by 53%, but it is a Pyrrhic victory. And you can see that the footage is actually getting out of sync because the 3060 Ti is so slow, it's not even able to sync the footage. So you know what, let's kick on at least DLSS at the quality setting. So using DLSS at the quality setting, the 3060 Ti is not choking so badly, and the 4060 Ti now has a 21% lead. And guys, it's like 30 FPS versus 35 FPS, okay? So this might be interesting in the, if you want to play around with path tracing to experience it and see what it's all about. But I do not think that this is the way that you should play the game. Notice I'm not enabling frame generation here because, as I discussed at the beginning of the video, if you don't have a high enough base frame rate, then even if it gets you over 60 FPS, if you started at 40, it actually makes the latency feel worse than 40, so it's not really something I would consider using unless my base frame rate was around at least the 60 FPS mark. You can see that the PC latency here is already high enough. I don't want to introduce any more latency into the playing experience. Now, you don't have to use ray tracing. I was mainly looking at Cyberpunk because I wanted to test out new features like frame generation and path tracing, all of that, but it is still just a graphically demanding game that we can benchmark. And if we do that at just 1080p Ultra, no ray tracing involved, no upscaling, no frame generation, the 4060 Ti now only has a 9% lead over the 3060 Ti, getting close to 100 FPS, while the 3060 Ti is around 90 FPS. It's not that big of an increase to the overall experience. Let's take a look at 1440p, and we'll jump in with ray tracing first. So using ray tracing Ultra, neither GPU was giving a great experience natively, so I just went ahead and kicked on DLSS quality, which at 1440p I do think looks a lot better than it does at 1080p. We see a 10% lead here for the 4060 Ti, so not that big of a lead, although you can enable frame generation. Once again, the PC latency going over that 50 millisecond mark, for me, it doesn't feel great with this low of a base frame rate. Now, you don't need to kick on ray tracing, though, to play the game, so what if we just played the game at 1440p ultra settings? We do see the 4060 Ti breaking 60 FPS through the benchmark, with the 3060 Ti hanging out a little bit below 60 FPS, but overall, it's not that big of a difference. It's a 10% average FPS lead for the 4060 Ti. So again, when we're not using the new frame generation feature, the actual just raw performance uplift does definitely leave a bit to be desired. Now, if we drop down to the high settings to try to get just a little more boost to the performance, we're now seeing the 4060 Ti drop to only an 8% lead. Now it's, pushing near to 70 FPS, and 3060 Ti has broken the 60 FPS line, but I think most people would honestly have trouble telling which GPU was in their system if they had a blind test between the two. I mean, there's an energy efficiency bonus here. You can see 200 watts on the older card versus a little over 140 on the newer card, which is certainly nice to have. And then, not that you're really going to play at these settings, but for the sake of completeness, I thought I'd just throw in a 4K test and see what happened. Since it seemed like the 4060 Ti was losing ground the higher the resolution went, probably due to it having the lower memory bus. I just wanted to see what happened if we kicked it up to 4K. Well, it looks like they're basically tied at 4K, no meaningful difference. They're both basically giving a 30 FPS experience at 4K high settings. Ultra would have been below 30, so I didn't bother showing that here. But the next big game engine for AAA gaming is definitely going to be Unreal Engine 5. Right now, Fortnite is the game to test that in. I'm using the replay feature to play things back in perfect side-by-sides here. And we're looking at maxed out 1080p epic settings with ray tracing turned on. And at these settings, we're seeing the 4060 Ti a little over 60 FPS much of the time, but definitely dipping well below that. And the 3060 Ti is averaging more like in the mid-50s, and we're seeing a 13% overall lead here for the 4060 Ti. So it is nice to get it to that 60 FPS line more frequently, but it's not that massive of a difference. And again, this is completely maxed out with the hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on. You certainly could turn the hardware accelerated ray tracing off. You could also reduce some settings, which is what we're doing here. So looking at 1080p high settings, we now actually have the 4060 Ti closer to 100 FPS a lot of the time, and the 3060 Ti more like in the mid-80s. And it's about a 15% lead for the 4060 Ti on average. So certainly doing a lot better here with the high settings. Now, I'm not testing out Fortnite specifically. I know a lot of people would use competitive settings, extremely low settings. I'm really using Fortnite to test Unreal Engine 5 performance with its new features like Lumen, Nanite, virtual shadow maps. And if we went below the high setting, then those features would be turned off, which kind of defeats the purpose. So anyway, let's go up to 1440p. If we go with the epic settings with ray tracing on, so maxed out here, we're seeing an 11% lead for the 4060 Ti. So again, losing a few percent relatively as we increase the resolution. Neither GPU doing an amazing job here, though, with 3060 Ti in the high 30s and the 4060 Ti in the low 40s. Basically, it's not looking like you're going to be maxing out Unreal Engine 5 games, unless maybe you upscale. So I turned on DLSS quality to see what would happen. So 1440p maxed out Unreal Engine 5 using DLSS quality upscaling. The 4060 Ti is still 11% faster, but now both GPUs are giving a much better experience, with the 4060 Ti hanging out just a little bit above 60 FPS on average, and the 3060 Ti a little bit below 60 FPS on average. So it's certainly not you know, crushing it, high frame rates and everything, but it does look like you can kick on DLSS and get a decent 1440p experience, and DLSS looks pretty good at 1440p. Now, another option would be dropping down to the high preset. Again, this keeps the features like Lumen and Nanite. I did turn off the hardware accelerated ray tracing. And now both GPUs are over 60 FPS. It's a 12% lead for the 4060 Ti. The 3060 Ti is hanging out right around 60, and the 4060 Ti is more like in the upper 60 FPS range. So again, it looks like you could use the 4060 Ti as a 1440p GPU, but it's definitely going to be with compromises in the latest titles. Now, just again, more for completeness than anything else, we've got the 4K resolution to test as well. And at the high settings, I didn't even bother showing you what happens if you go to Epic with RT on. Basically, it's a slideshow. We're breaking 30 FPS on both GPUs, but neither of them making it to 40. It's only a 9% lead for the 4060 Ti. But again, I don't think either of these GPUs really make sense as a 4K GPU unless you're sticking mostly to older or very lightweight titles. It is what it is. Hey, how about Star Wars Jedi Survivor? This is one of the latest and greatest looking games out there, although it's been accused of some pretty bad optimization at launch. It has had a lot of patches. I think we're on patch like 5 now. This is the latest patch as of filming. We're seeing maxed out at 1080p, so epic settings with ray tracing enabled. The 4060 Ti hanging out around 70 FPS with the 3060 Ti, you know, lower to mid 60s. It's an 11% lead for the 4060 Ti. This game doesn't have any DLSS or frame generation or anything like that. It does have FSR2. Don't really like the look of it that much in this game myself, but if you want to gain some performance, you could go down to the high preset, and I also turned off the ray tracing, and now we're getting a nice high refresh rate experience on both GPUs, really. The 4060 Ti up around 100 FPS, and the 3060 Ti in the upper 80s. It's about a 12% lead for the 4060 Ti against its predecessor. Again, no extra features to turn on here, although some games are getting DLSS 3 patched into, not patched into them, but modded into them. So you could look into that type of thing, but that's not what I'm testing out in this video. Now, what if we wanted to do 1440p? Well, once again, we're seeing that the latest and greatest games that are designed with graphics around the latest console generation without worrying about backwards compatibility to the older consoles are very demanding. And at 1440p epic with ray tracing on, the 4060 Ti is not going to give you 60 FPS. It's closer to 50 FPS with the 3060 Ti kind of in the mid-40s. It's an 11% lead relatively for the 4060 Ti over its last generation predecessor. So once again, when you don't have any of the extra features, you get about now a 12% lead if we drop down to the high settings. So I was again curious, okay, if you want to use this at 1440p in a game that doesn't have DLSS or anything, what are you going to do? Well, dropping down to high preset, turning off ray tracing, we are breaking 60 FPS now on the 4060 Ti, and the 3060 Ti is kind of in the mid-50s. It's a 12% lead for the 4060 Ti over the previous gen predecessor. And again, in this game, I don't have like an exact benchmark. There's no built-in benchmark to use, and I'm not using a cutscene because I wanted actual gameplay performance. So sorry if things get a little out of sync. It's just me trying my best to do the same run every time. Anyway, now I don't think, once again, that 4K resolution really makes sense on these GPUs, but for the sake of completeness, I did go ahead and test it out. So here we are looking at 4K at the high settings. I did test out Epic with ray tracing on, and I didn't bother including the results here. At least at the high setting, you can get to about 30 FPS on the 4060 Ti, although the 1% lows certainly drop below 30, so you couldn't even do it a flat 30 FPS lock. It's 11% lead for the 4060 Ti, but yeah, just don't play the latest and greatest games at 4K on these GPUs. Now, A Plague Tale Requiem is, again, a game focused on the current generation of consoles. And both of these GPUs do well here at 1080p. It's a 10% lead for the 4060 Ti, averaging in the mid 80s through this cutscene. Actual gameplay will often be closer to 60 or 70 FPS, but you definitely get a very playable experience, especially in this slow pace of a game. No real issues here. Now, looking at 1440p Ultra, we get an 8% lead for the 4060 Ti. Now, I should mention that this game does feature frame generation, and I actually think that it works very, very well here. But honestly, I work a full-time job besides running this channel, and I was just running out of benchmarking time. Guys, I'm not just doing this head-to-head, I benchmarked a lot of other GPUs that I'm going to showcase, so I did not have the chance to test out Plague Tale as much as I wanted to. However, how about The Last of Us Part 1? And this is on the latest patch, patch 1.0.5.0 at 1080p Ultra, and they're doing fine. This game's had a lot, like I said, the patches have made a huge difference. The VRAM management has gotten a lot better, and so now the 4060 Ti is actually hanging out around 69 nice FPS on average through this scene. The 3060 Ti, though, pretty much doing about the same. It's only a 5% lead for the 4060 Ti. But what if we turn it down to high settings? Wait a second, what just happened? Now the 4060 Ti is leading by 16%. And I think what's going on here is that at the ultra settings, both GPUs are spilling over their 8GB VRAM buffer, because while the patches have improved VRAM management, they still use more than 8GB at the ultra settings. So by going down to the high setting, things actually do look a lot better than they did on the high setting when the game launched, and the 8GB VRAM is now no longer an issue, and the 4060 Ti is able to show off more of its true potential without being held back by waiting for accessing system RAM. Now, going up to 1440p at the ultra settings, we once again see both GPUs performing very similarly, only a 5% lead for the 4060 Ti, and once again, I think it's that both of them are having to access the system memory, so they're kind of having to wait for that, and it's slowing them both down. Potentially, that's slowing the 4060 Ti down more relatively due to relying more on cache than on the memory bus. I don't know. But if you go down to the high settings, I did see the 4060 Ti increase its lead to 8%, and so, you know, doing a little bit better here. And again, the high settings are using much less VRAM, although at 1440p, I think the high settings still can spill over that 8GB mark at times, so that could be factoring in to some of these results. But just overall, if you this game has gotten significantly better, especially with the textures being reauthored, so that when you turn them down from the ultra textures, they still actually look pretty good now, which is nice. Now at 4K, I'm not going to bother showing the ultra results, but the high results could actually get you around 30 frames per second on both GPUs. It ends up only being about a 7% lead for the 4060 Ti, although its 1% lows dropped really low. There's definitely some stutters going through this area, and both GPUs, even at the high settings rather than ultra, are going over. But 4K is not really, like I said, that realistic of a use case here. Now, The Last of Us Part 1 was an example of a PlayStation 5 exclusive ported to PC that was extremely heavy on VRAM. But not every PlayStation 5 game that's been ported to PC has been heavy on VRAM. Returnal is another example of a PS5 port to PC, and it is here on its 1080p Epic settings, only hanging out around under 5 GB of actual VRAM usage, and both GPUs are performing extremely well. We're close to 100 FPS on the 4060 Ti and in the upper 80s on the 3060 Ti, with a 10% lead for the 4060 Ti overall. And even going up to 1440p Epic settings, the VRAM is still only hanging out around 5 GB, and we have a 9% lead for the 4060 Ti, which, again, not that big of a difference. We're going from kind of the upper mid-60s to the low 70s. So very similar experience overall. This game does have DLSS, which we could use. It also does have ray tracing, which you could enable and which would reduce performance. But I was just sticking with the maximum preset in the game, which does not include the ray tracing. But again, if you wanted a further performance boost, you could get it with DLSS. Now, going up to 4K at epic settings, both GPUs are, kind of playable, but realistically you would turn down settings and probably use DLSS. But at native 4K epic settings, which, like I said, mostly just testing for the sake of completeness in the review, we're seeing only a 5% lead for the 4060 Ti. So once again, we're seeing the trend of the higher the resolution goes, the 4060's lead over the previous generation trails off a bit, likely to do with the change to the memory bus versus relying on more on the L2 cache, that kind of stuff. Now, I thought while we're testing out PS5 games that have been ported to PC, we'd take a look at Forspoken. Not as popular or as good of a game as the last two we just looked at, but it is an example of a PS5 game ported to PC. At 1080p ultra high preset, which does include the ray tracing, we see, 62 FPS versus like 57 FPS, 56 FPS. So there you go. If we go up to 1440p ultra high, now both GPUs are just absolutely struggling. It's an 8% lead for the 4060 Ti, but they're, it's like upper 30s versus slightly lower upper 30s. They're not doing well. They're both going well over their VRAM buffer. So this is a game that again, more like The Last of Us as a PS5 game, has a massive VRAM budget, and going up to 4K 4K resolution just crushes them. So they basically tie in a just a total loss at about 17 FPS. Now, Resident Evil 4 Remake is not a PS5 exclusive. It was a cross-gen console game. And at launch, if you tried to run the max preset on an 8GB GPU, it would just crash. However, the game has been patched and is doing a lot better now. And the 4060 Ti is 18% faster than 3060 Ti here. And it's averaging around 92 FPS versus 78, 79 FPS. So definitely a nice lead here for the 4060 Ti and great overall performance. Now, honestly, the ray tracing in this game doesn't even look good. It's very blurry reflections. So if you just go to the prioritize graphics preset, which I think is the second highest beyond max, but not the ray tracing preset, now both GPUs are basically tied, but they're both absolutely crushing it at over 140 FPS. So really good result. The 3060 Ti is technically ahead, but I mean, it's like 1 or 2 FPS when you're at over 140 FPS. But again, it's not great to see the 4060 Ti not actually taking a lead, though. Now, if we look at 1440p now, again, the maximum preset, which does include ray tracing, now the GPUs are struggling more. I think the VRAM is becoming more of an issue, and we're seeing a 17% lead for the 4060 Ti, but the 4060 Ti is only a little over 50 FPS. Now, it can produce much higher results when it's not choking on VRAM and stuttering, but it's certainly becoming more of an issue here. Now, at the prioritize graphics setting, which again doesn't involve ray tracing, both GPUs are actually doing really well, although I'm actually seeing the 3060 Ti ahead by 10%. I did make sure the settings applied correctly. I restarted the game. I don't know, guys. It's the result that I'm seeing. The 3060 Ti is winning by 10% at around 100 FPS versus around 90 FPS. So that's just the result that I got. Now, going up to Resident Evil 4 Remake at 4K maximum preset, which is not really what these GPUs are made for, but we're doing it anyway. We are seeing the 4060 Ti now with a 24% lead. But both GPUs are not doing well. The 3060 Ti is below 30 FPS. The 4060 Ti is in the mid-30s, but it's not a great experience with 1% lows around 12. It's definitely a VRAM issue. Now, if you just go to the prioritize graphics preset, we are now seeing the 3060 Ti leading again. Like I said, guys, I did make sure settings applied correctly. I restarted the game after switching them. The 3060 Ti is winning by 19%. I don't know what to tell you. It's close to 60 FPS, and the 4060 Ti is hanging out, a little below 50 FPS. So weird results, but I'm just bringing you the results. Now, let's switch over to one more game. How about Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2? And at this one, I'm running at the balanced preset, and so at 1080p balance, we're getting 27% lead for the 4060 Ti, which is a great result. That's one of the best results we've seen for the 4060 Ti relative to the 3060 Ti, and I'm running at the balanced preset because I think it's more realistic to how people would actually play this game. Since it's an online competitive game, you're less likely to turn up all the graphic settings, you're more likely to turn things down a bit to increase your competitive advantage. So how about moving up to 1440p? Well, at the 1440p balanced preset, we're seeing a 25% lead for the 4060 Ti. And this is further confirming what I think I've noticed in my other reviews is that I think this game likes cache. And since the 4060 Ti has that massively increased L2 cache, I think that's what this game likes, because this game also likes AMD's 6000 series GPUs with their infinity cache. So well, the 6000 series AMD GPUs had a big advantage over NVIDIA's 3000 series. It looks like the 4060 Ti, with its large cache size, is carrying over a bit of that same thing that this game engine seems to like. At least that's what I'm guessing, guys. I can't absolutely confirm that for you. I think that explains results. But anyway, let's get some final thoughts at the end. I have so many thoughts about those benchmarks, but let's start with this. If I wanted to buy a 3060 Ti right now, I could buy one used. This is at today's sponsor, Jawa.gg, where you can buy and sell both used and new PC parts, including entire gaming PCs. But let's actually use it as part of the video. I want to buy a 3060 Ti. Hey, look, $265 right here. Card looks to be in fine shape. I mean, as long as the used card works, we should be good. And so we've got a used card here for $265. That's a lot less than $400, and it seems like it would get me to about 10% or so of the, away from the performance of this new $400 card, same amount of VRAM, all of that. So that's a pretty big deal. Also, again, if you want to fund your upgrade of a new GPU, one of the best ways to do that is to sell your old parts, which you can do right here on Jawa. And so anyway, a lot of really good deals on this site. And like I said, you can even buy whole new PCs, but I highly recommend it for selling your old parts to help fund your new upgrade. Anyway, if you do want to buy new, now Jawa does have new stuff, but let's survey a variety of new listings. PC Part Picker, who is not a sponsor of today's video, but is a useful site for surveying a lot of big retailers all at once with a price low to high search. So this is like Amazon, Best Buy, Newegg, all of the major stuff. 3060 Ti, price search low to high, $391. So if you're buying one new, which is honestly the most fair comparison, but we should acknowledge that used cards do exist, then okay, is the 4060 Ti better? Meaning if they cost the same amount of money, I think it's obvious that the 4060 Ti is better. So there is a glass half full and glass half empty way of looking at this situation. Overall, you know, if the cards cost the same, and hey, at least we didn't get a price hike here, all of the other 40 series cards have increased their price relative to the previous generation at the same tier. At least that didn't happen. Are we getting more performance? Yes. How much? Well, NVIDIA, this is their marketing slides, claimed a 15% increase without frame generation and a 1.7x time if you factor in frame generation. I think in my testing, I was seeing the uplift. Certainly we did see examples of 15%, and even a few that were more than 15%. I think more frequently we were between 10 to 15% faster with a few less, and definitely a few more. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was a standout example, so if you play a lot of Warzone, something like that, maybe that sweetens the deal. But overall, I'd say 10 to 15% faster seems a bit more accurate. And is that worth the upgrade over the 3060 Ti? Well, if you're offered both cards for the same price, we at least did get some generational price to performance uplift. It's not complete stagnation. Also, Its energy efficiency was quite good. I think my testing did confirm that the 3060 Ti was usually hanging out close to 200 watts, and the 4060 Ti was usually hanging out close to 140 watts. It's nice to save energy, which will, over time, save you money, and possibly could mean that you can squeak by with a smaller power supply, all sorts of advantages here. It could run cooler, put off less heat into your room. You do get the new AV1 encoder. You do get DLSS 3 frame generation, which I did show off. But in the end, I think most people want a 30 to 50% generational uplift at the same price, and they aren't getting that. It's more like 10 to 15% with some cool new features. They are good features. I like the energy efficiency. I like DLSS 3 frame generation. I think it really feels like this entire 40 series is trying to be sold on the features rather than the raw performance. So let's talk a bit more about frame generation. What I was trying to show in this video is, first of all, the games I selected were just trying to capture a large amount of games that are, for example, PS5 exclusives, current gen console exclusives, some of the most popular big new AAA releases. And 2 of the games I selected happen to have frame generation. I tested it really thoroughly in this video using Cyberpunk. And what we see is it is a situational feature. You're not going to use it in competitive gaming. So if your use case is competitive gaming, it does nothing for you. And a lot of people are primarily competitive gamers. If you're a single player gamer, you might have more use for it, but you do need to get a high enough base frame rate for it to be a good feature to use. When the frame rate is low, it increases latency, and so if you already wanted more responsiveness you want the higher frame rate to get the more responsiveness, you're not going to get it by enabling frame gen, even when it pushes you over the 60 FPS limit. It doesn't feel like 60 FPS. Also, the lower the frame rate, the larger the difference is between the 2 real frames that the then AI-generated frame is being inserted in between, which means that there's more errors in the frames the lower the frame rate is, because there's a larger difference between the 2 real frames, right? So in general, I've found that I want to have the base frame rate of the game at around 60 frames per second already before I find frame generation a particularly useful feature. And I do find it a useful feature in those circumstances. I actually played Plague Tale Requiem using it. Even though I had a 4090, I actually liked getting that extra boost to smoothness in the image at 4K resolution. I did use it. There's been a lot of other games where I have turned it on and tried it out, but there's been a lot of other games I'm playing. Like right now, I am personally playing Jedi Survivor and The Last of Us Part 1. Neither of those games has frame generation, right? So while those are single-player games where it might be a useful feature, they don't have it, right? Some games are getting it modded in and all of that, but the point is, you can't rely on frame generation as being something that will get you to 60 FPS if you weren't already there, because while it won't feel like it, so it's kind of defeating the purpose. And you can't rely on every game having it. And if you're primarily a competitive gamer, it's not useful for you there. Which means I do think it is a very good feature. I like to have it, but it's not something that's going to, I think, make up for the fact that we're seeing a 10 to 15%. I think 15% we saw was a bit, not completely inaccurate, but at least in my testing, we didn't quite get there, right? In other words, it's nice. We did get a better card at $400 than we had before. There is an improvement in price to performance, as well as features and energy and efficiency. It's just less of an improvement than I think a lot of people would want. In other words, I think what a lot of people will feel about this is that, first of all, if you already have a 3060 Ti, is it worth the hassle of the upgrade and whatever amount of money you would lose if maybe you sold your 3060 Ti on Jawa? Well, you're not going to get $400 for it. So now you have to make up the price gap. And is a 10 to 15% performance increase plus, you know, frame generation and AV1 encoding, which again is a situational thing. Are you a live streamer or a content creator? If the answer is no, then that doesn't really do anything for you, right? So I think for a lot of people, if you already have a 3060 Ti, this is definitely a skip generation. No real point going through the hassle of upgrading. If you're further behind though, so NVIDIA did also want to point out that, hey, if you had a 2060 Super, maybe this is then worth the upgrade. And, you know, I didn't test that in this video, but, you know, their testing numbers from what I saw here weren't completely out of line, claiming 15%. Might have been a little less in my test, but 10 to 15%. So let's say maybe 50, 60% uplift on the 2060 Super. My personal opinion is a GPU upgrade starts to be worth it. Like, is it worth the hassle of selling my GPU and getting a new one? I would want to get at least 50% performance uplift for it to be worth my time and money. So the 2060 Super is right on that borderline. I think most people will be most happy if you upgrade and like double your performance. Then it's just like, wow, night and day difference, love my new PC, right? But if you get a 50% performance boost, that's still very noticeable and worthwhile. So could somebody on a 2060 Super or older upgrade to this and be pretty happy? Yes, but also could you just hang on and wait for next gen or for prices to come down? There's also the 8 gigabytes of VRAM hanging out here as the elephant in the room. So NVIDIA did say, I did not mean to move that, I meant to move myself out of the way, that there is a 16 gigabyte version of this card coming in July at $499. Well, I think the problem with that is that it's $499. I think the 16 gigabytes is a compelling reason to upgrade. Now, in my testing, you know, it'll be interesting this, like, I'm also benchmarking this against some other GPUs, including the 6700 XT from AMD, which is a 12 gigabyte card. And so expect that video coming out soon, where you can see how much some extra VRAM might help a little bit, and if there's situations where that ends up being relevant. I think it'll be interesting to see with the 16 gigabyte card, because with that one, it's like, okay, you could wait for the 16 gigabyte card, but do you really want to pay the extra $100 for that? Because the 16 gigabyte version of this is going to be up against some pretty stiff competition. If 6800 XTs are still on the market, the 6800 XT costs around $500 right now. It also has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, but considering that this basically performs, our 4060 Ti is performing a lot like a 3070. That's another head-to-head comparison that I'm going to show you guys in a future video. It performs a lot like a 3070, and the 6800 XT is noticeably faster than a 3070. Maybe VRAM, maybe the, you know, sorry, not my VRAM, but maybe ray tracing, the features, all of that. But I'm just going to say, I think this will be a really interesting comparison when that comes out. So is it worth waiting for the 16 gigabyte version? I mean, man, I think if NVIDIA had given the 16 gigabyte version as the only version and done it at $399, then people would have more of a reason to upgrade. If you're on a 3060 Ti, I think a lot of people are starting to get concerned about the 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So jumping to the 16 gigabyte version might be more compelling, but again, if it was at $399, if it's at $500, it's now a $100 premium, and I don't think 8 gigabytes of VRAM costs $100 these days, guys. So there's definitely some margins being made there. Anyway, we've got a 4060 coming in July, 16 gigabyte. So anyway, just stay tuned to the channel. I'm going to be doing some detailed head-to-head comparisons of the 4060 Ti. The next one you'll see from me will probably be the 6700 XT up against the 4060 Ti. But I'm also going to do it against the 3060. I'm curious, hey, 3060 has 12 gigabytes and costs a lot less. I wonder what would happen in the latest and greatest games. Benchmarking is complete. I just need to do the head-to-heads and do the voiceover and all of that. I'm also going to look at the 3070. How does it do against that? How does it do against, oh man, I think I've got 4070, you know, 4060 Ti versus 4070. The 4070 is a lot more money, right? So 4070 is still coming in at almost $600. So is it worth doing that? So anyway, lots more head-to-heads coming up on the channel. I should probably stop talking and get some sleep because I have been running way too much benchmarking. And if you are looking to upgrade, I do recommend taking a look at Jawa, both to check out their prices on both new and used products, including maybe even looking at a full gaming PC build. You can sell your components here, all sorts of stuff. Check the link in the description, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.